Rosanne and grunge music, what they have in common, and why they came into popularity pretty much at the same time. Next on Retro Serial Podcast Edition. Welcome to the program. I'm Ian C. I'm your host for this episode of Retro Serial Podcast Edition. Today we're going to be talking about what Rosanne, the television show, and grunge music have in common, and as I've already said, why they gained popularity around the same time. Before we get into that program, there are a couple of details we have to address today. There are a couple issues we have to address today. The first thing is, as always, if you're listening to this and you haven't subscribed, let me encourage you to take that step to subscribe. It's a small step for you, but it certainly means a lot for us here on the channel. And if you've already subscribed, please like this video and share this video on your favorite social media, which really helps us to grow our platform, really helps us to grow our audience, and means so much to us here on the channel at Retro Serial. And if you want to go that one extra step and you're looking to donate your funds, we do provide a page to our Buy Me a Coffee account, which is something like Patreon. Now, eventually I will get a Patreon page. I do know that on Patreon, there are a lot of people who have Patreon offer exclusive content, and that's kind of the draw to get to Patreon. At this point, between doing my two channels here on YouTube and also the day jobs that I actually still have, being able to do more content than what I'm putting out right now is a little bit beyond my capabilities. So bear with me. Eventually, though, I'm hoping that I'll be able to do YouTube full-time, and that I will be able to then put some extra effort into creating exclusive Patreon videos so that I can draw members to Patreon. But until then, if you are interested in helping us out financially, you can use the Buy Me a Coffee page. It would really mean a lot to us and really help us to make improvements here on the show. As you can already see, again, as I've said before, we're trying to renovate this room out. I'm getting decor in the background, making it a little bit better, getting some better equipment, some better video editing software to just bring you the best videos in regards to 80s, 90s, and 70s nostalgia of growing up Generation X. All right. Also, you may have already noticed that I've been saying welcome to Retro Serial Podcast rather than Some Cereal for Dinner Podcast. Yes, I changed the name. This is the third time that I've changed it. And there are a couple reasons why I changed the name, and I want to share those with you before we jump into the program today, so you kind of know what's going on. When I first decided to do this show, I really just wanted to call it Cereal for Dinner. And I looked up Cereal for Dinner and I didn't see any other podcasts out there. And it was just an oversight on my part because there was a podcast called Cereal for Dinner. So I decided, in light of hoping not to get sued, to change it to Some Cereal for Dinner and then put podcast at the end. But that seemed to be pretty long and involved, and I didn't like saying all those words. And then plus, when I say Some Cereal for Dinner Podcast, it makes us think that this is only a podcasting thing. And no, podcast is part of what I do, but there are like video exclusives that I do on YouTube. And when you're on YouTube, it was saying Some Cereal for Dinner Podcast. And while there are podcasts on YouTube, and people sometimes do use YouTube to listen to their podcasts or watch their podcasts, normally people are on YouTube to watch videos and not podcasts. So I felt like I was excluding some audience from my YouTube platform. Now, as far as the audio platform, if you're listening to this because it's a podcast. But I can always say Retro Serial Podcast. And of course, if it's on a podcast platform, you know that it is a podcast. But I felt like that was too long and encumbersome. And it was maybe on the video form, it was excluding some audience. And the other thing was that the title of the show didn't really reflect kind of what was going on in the program. And people that I listen to that talk about like how to grow your podcast and how to grow your YouTube station or your YouTube platform really suggested that the name of your video or the name of your channel should really reflect what you're doing. Otherwise, people might not tune in. So if people are looking for retro and nostalgia, they don't know that this is a retro and nostalgia show. They might think it's something else and that I'm just happening to do something on retro and nostalgia and then not be interested and click on through. So that's part of the reason I decided to change the name. And the other reason was I'm not sure that Some Cereal for Dinner podcast is different enough from Cereal for Dinner to really make a huge difference to not get sued. So we'll see. I mean, I might change it. I don't know. YouTube right now makes it real easy, and podcasting platforms make it real easy to change the name and still have the same videos up. And I'm early enough in this. I've only done like 14 or 15 podcasts at this point that I don't think it'll affect me too much as far as the name change is concerned. I don't plan on changing the name again. I'm hoping that one of these names will stick. I hope it's not like, changing the name of your band every few days or every, so often. So I'm hoping this will stick. And then finally, no guests on the show. This is just going to be a monologue. I will have guests on the show again next week. I'm really looking forward to getting Brian McDonald back on the show. We're going to be talking about some more psychological issues of growing up Generation X. Dave Sundstrom is going to be back on the show, God willing, and we're going to be talking about TV families and stuff like that. Just some fun stuff. Growing up Generation X. And different things like that. So, there are going to be, and I'm going to actually have a couple other returning guests too. The comic book store guy, Brian, who we're going to talk about the new episodes of Star Wars and things of that nature, and just some other stuff that we're going to be kicking around here as we talk about, our childhood and what stuck with us in our childhood. And speaking of what sticks with us in our childhood, that brings us to today's subject. And you might be a little like, you might be making connections already in your mind. You might be asking yourself, well, how does Rosanne, the Rosanne Show, and grunge music, how do those things connect? And you already might be making connections. So you probably are seeing connections that I'm not seeing, and I'd be interested in what those connections are in the comments below. Leave those comments below. But here's what I wanted to get at. The show Roseanne rose to fame in the late 80s, I think it was 88 to 1997 is how long the show ran. And it struck a chord with middle America, particularly white class middle America. And I'll get to the differences here between what was happening in the black community and what was happening in the white community. And no racial tension here or anything like that. I'm just going to be talking about the programming that was going on. And I'll address that in due course and why there's an important distinction there to be made. But I want to start with this. I want to talk about why it was that show rose to fame so quickly and what it was about that show that made it so popular and made it so famous in fact that they did a reboot, which of course didn't last long for a host of political problems that we're not going to get into here on the show. But let's start with the background of the show, okay? And then I'm going to relate this to what I've already talked about with alternative rock and popular rock of that era. And you'll see the connections. And again, if you see other connections, let me know. So first of all, I want to start out with the fact that a lot of television shows that I grew up with were really out of touch with the reality of their audiences. And this is true of Hollywood in general, and it's true of TV in particular. So and you can see this in a variety of ways of how they are out of touch with the audiences that they that they are in contact with. And we'll get into why that might not necessarily be a horrible thing altogether, but that there is a disconnect. First of all, you can see the disconnect in the types of occupations that they have. For example, one of the movies that I absolutely love is Fools Rush In. And I was watching Fools Rush In a couple days ago. It's heavy rotation in my house. I'll put it on while I'm working on something else. If it's on television, which I hardly ever watch anymore, like TNT or something, TBS or something like that, I'll always just leave it on. But the main character had a job where he was this high-powered salesperson and building casinos and building buildings and stuff like that, and working at this high-profile job on Wall Street. And I'm thinking to myself, this is not my world. This is not the world of that of people that I run into on a regular basis. And you can really tell that Hollywood is out of touch with the world that we run into on a regular basis because of that very fact. Now, the show, what the person goes through and his relationship with the girl, it's all real relatable, and we watch it for those reasons, and we relate to it on that level. But as far as like the people are concerned, and the jobs that they have, and the cars that they drive, and it really seems to be out of touch in a lot of ways with how I grew up, at least, and how a lot of people that I know grew up. Now, let's bring this disconnect down to TV just a minute, and we can see this in the occupations of the TV families that were prevalent during that era. So I just did a top 5 of TV moms and TV dads, and I was just thinking about their occupation. So, for instance, one of the TV shows that I love the most and have loved the most over the years is Family Ties, as you know. But the father, Stephen Keaton, worked at PBS. He worked at public broadcasting. He worked in television. I didn't know a lot of fathers who worked in television. None of my friends who had fathers worked in television. It just wasn't that kind of community. The mother was an architect. I didn't know a lot of mothers who were architects either, and you can go right down the line. You looked at the Huxtables, and Theodore Huxtable was a doctor, and Claire Huxtable was an attorney. I didn't have too many friends whose parents were doctors and attorneys. And you can even look further down the line at, like I mentioned, growing pains. The father there was a therapist. That's a little bit more common, but still not so common that, every other household, the person was a therapist. For goodness sakes, it just didn't seem to happen. And, different strokes. Mr. Drummond was a millionaire. It just seems like Hollywood is a little out of touch with the common person. And so the families are out of touch. And so when we're watching it, there's this gap between what the family's like and what we're doing. Not only you can see this reflected in the jobs, but you can also see this reflected in the family dynamic as well. For the most part, you have intact families. And growing up in a generation that was on the rise, broken homes, for me, that wasn't that common. As a matter of fact, a lot of my friends came from broken homes, divorced homes, spending some time with mom, some time with dad. Now, I do have to admit that where I grew up was a small town in Utah, and so Mormonism was super prevalent, and so there was some of that family tact that was still there, but it certainly wasn't my experience, and it wasn't really the experience of my closest friends. I'm just thinking about my closest friends, and either they were in a blended family due to divorce, or they were just living with a single mom or a single dad. As I was, just thinking about my friends as I was growing up. But the families in TV land at the time were generally intact families and functioned well as families. The father was not necessarily the sole breadwinner, but still the leader of the home. And he wasn't just the leader of the home, but he was also, how would you put it? He was the main breadwinner. The mother, even though they had jobs outside the home, they still didn't, that job outside the home didn't interfere at all with how they ran the home, the function of the home. The day-to-day of the home didn't seem to interfere with that at all. They were still able to be good mothers and still run the homes. And then the families that were blended wasn't a result of divorce. It was always a result of widowhood of some kind. You think of, you think of a classic family like the Brady Bunch. It's a blended family, but it's based on the fact that the father's wife died and the mother's husband died. And then here's this family that comes together. And that was a little bit common because divorce was somewhat of a taboo situation, and TV wanted to still say, hey, there's blended families, but we don't want to talk about divorce. And you can see the separation in the children as well, and how the children interacted with each other. The children, for the most part, had normal and benign problems. It's kind of like, they would get on each other's nerves, and some of it was a little bit ridiculous. It's kind of the, who's been in my room? Oh my gosh, it's the end of the world. My little sister was in my room, kind of a thing. It wasn't anything that reflected, in my experience, reality, as my friends had siblings and were dealing with the siblings, dealing with what their siblings were doing. And what the siblings are doing to each other and to their parents. There wasn't any cases of, your little sister stealing money from you, or stealing cigarettes from your mother or something like that. There wasn't any of that going on, which was going on a lot in the families that I grew up with and watching TV. Now, it didn't stop me from loving these families. I mean, it didn't stop. It wasn't like I had this filter on that said, now what's the difference? I'm watching these families. What's the difference now? That's not what was going on in my head. But as I look back on it, I can see the differences. And then you can see the differences as well when finally a connection is made in a family like Rosanne. It's almost like if you've only ever kind of eaten bad food, junk food, if you're always eating top ramen and peanut butter and jelly sandwiches, and somebody finally comes and makes you, pot roast and mashed potatoes and stuff like that, you're like, whoa, I can't believe what I'm missing. So the filter is not one of these filters that you have in your brain that's on all the time. You are still making connections with the characters and the family based on the connections you do have, and not on the connections you don't have. And a lot of times those connections you don't have are the ways it doesn't reflect you. You just edit those out in your brain. They don't show up unless you're particularly looking for them. So another way that happened was in some of the trouble that they got into. As I said, now they did tackle some taboo issues. Excuse me, I'm drinking a lot of coffee right now. So I got to take breaks periodically to drink my coffee. But let me just say this. Yeah, they did do a lot of issues. I talked about that in a previous video. The Mr. Belvedere taught me about AIDS, where I talk about the issues that they deal with. But it was even those issues, which were at times very serious, were handled like super well. And I get it. TV's imaginary. They're supposed to be handled super well. But maybe an example of what I'm talking about. So Alex P. Keaton at one point gets involved with speed. And, he misses a test. He wakes up. It's a big deal on the show. But it's like, even in that, it was just like, well, why is he getting involved with drugs? So he can be better at school, right? And it's just like, this is Really? I mean, I didn't live in that world. I didn't take drugs. None of my friends took drugs so we could do better on homework, so we could be better at school, I did not take drugs so I could get better grades. So this in a sense in which this is out of touch with reality on all kinds of levels, on the level of what they do for occupations, on the family structure, and on family issues. It just didn't reflect the the things that I was going through, my closest friends. And of course, I don't speak for everybody, but there's a good segment I know of Generation X that were not dealing with those problems the way families were dealing with those problems, at least portrayed on television. Now, before we get to the connection then that's made with the Connor household in Roseanne, let's talk about some of the exceptions, because I know that there are going to be people who are going to be saying, hey, I remember some shows that weren't like that. And so I want to talk a little bit about some exceptions to the rule. And one exception would be like the television show Alice. I saw that as a pretty big exception. She was a single mother raising her boy. She had an occupation as a waitress. It wasn't some high, lofty occupation. It was as a waitress, and it was around a restaurant, and so that was one of those situations which connected with people more than others, or didn't have that huge disconnect. And the other place I saw this, and I brought this up before, was in the Black community. With Black sitcoms, it's our sitcoms that were associated around Black families and households, particularly in the 70s, you didn't see that disconnect. So you're thinking of shows like What's Happening and a few other shows that you can think of. They tended to be more sarcastic. They tended to be Sanford and Son. They tended to be more representative of what was happening in the Black community. And when I'm talking about this, is like I'm worried about like racial injustice and stuff. And somebody, it's like I'm like, you want to be so careful that you don't say anything negative or bad, or it's perceived as negative and bad, even if you don't intend it negative as bad, that you almost don't say anything at all. So let me just say that I don't think that the Black community would put up with the disconnect as well. I don't think that at all. I think that the TV executives, if every show was like the Huxtables or something like that, they would just turn the Black community off. I think the Black community was much more in touch. The TV was much more in touch and reflective of the issues going on in the Black community than it was in the white community. In the white community, you had a bunch of kids who were from broken homes and stuff looking at this perfect family. And in the Black community, you had this sassy family that was really funny and outrageous, and that even carried through. And I even remember one that we did watch a lot, because I didn't really watch too many of those shows other than the Jeffersons. The Jeffersons were one of my all-time favorite shows when I was growing up, particularly in the 70s and real early 80s. But even they were, like the guy was a rich dude, but he was a rich dude who came from a poor place, and he brought all that sass with him into gosh, I hope people don't hate me for saying stuff like this. Yeah, it's like I'm so worried about saying anything at all that I'm not saying anything at all. So, but that's just my opinion. That's how I was looking at it. He tended to bring that realism, I should say, of the Black community into his then privileged existence as he gained wealth. And I just don't think that there was as big of a disconnect between that. So the idea was that there were exceptions to this. There were exceptions, but not many of them. until you get to the late 80s. And before we get into that, I want to relate this to music. Okay, so I want to go back to music here for just a second. Because that same disconnect that you find in the TV drama and the actual family is the same disconnect you found in music and the people who are listening to it. And there was a couple ways you experienced that disconnect from the rock star to the rock listener who wanted to be a rock star. And I'm only going to talk about rock music here because it's the music genre that I'm most familiar with. And if you grew up listening to pop or something like that, you might find some of these same connections. I don't know. I didn't grow up listening to that kind of stuff, although I may heard it, but that wasn't in heavy rotation in my life. But there was that same disconnect. How so? Okay. So the disconnect really was between the lifestyle that the people who were in rock music portrayed and the lyrical content that was in rock music at the time. And I'm talking rock music in general, heavy metal in particular, and even glam metal, maybe more exclusive. But the same things kind of happened. That same disconnect happened. So for example, let me give you an example. First of all, you could see that disconnect in the way that they dressed. And the way that they dressed was a way that the average person could never dress due to a lot of times just finances. And I'm not even talking about the glam metal, over the top expensive stuff. I'm just, even a regular rock star during that era would, for example, be wearing a pair of like leather jeans or a real expensive leather coat, which I couldn't afford. I wasn't walking around in leather pants, and I didn't have a leather coat. About the most I had could do was denim, and the musical instruments they played. For me to be as an aspiring rock musician, I had an off-brand guitar and a very small PV amp for most of my life. And so did most of my friends. And I loved those things. Don't misunderstand me. I mean, I still remember the first guitar that I ever got. My grandmother bought it for me. But it was a $50 guitar from a pawn shop. And, I think it was 1988 or something around there or 80, maybe it was 86. And I mean, $50 was a lot back then. It's still not a small amount today. But it wasn't a Stratocaster, it wasn't an Ibanez, it wasn't a Gibson, it wasn't and my friends weren't playing that either. And if one of the friends had it was because he came from a rich household, or it was a super, bestowed upon gift, like from a grandparent or something like that. And my friends weren't playing Marshall stacks. We were playing small PV amps and plugging our microphone into another PV amp and just not putting the distortion on. There was this huge disconnect between the rock star and what we were doing. And then that disconnect came out in lifestyle, but it also came out in lyrical content. Because the lyrical content were things like being on the road all the time. I wasn't on the road all the time, so how would I know? Things. It was things of excess, girl troubles that I wasn't really having at that point in my life. It just seemed to be based around desires that separated people by money for the most part. And then the grunge scene hit, and why it connected with so many people is because the grunge scene was like, this person looks just like me. This person looks, like they're wearing the torn jeans not because they tore them to be cool, but they tore them because that's the only jeans that they could afford, And that's the jeans that they had been wearing all day. And because they had been wearing those jeans all day, that's the jeans that they were in the music video with. And that's the jeans that they were in, and their lyrical content was content that the average person could identify with. Not necessarily somebody who has a ton of money and a ton of influence could identify with. And that's one of the reasons it took off so darn well and so darn quickly, is it connected with a generation of people who they looked like, they sounded like, they dressed like, and you could just identify with that, with what they were going through. And that's at least one of the reasons why it became so popular. So that's what the Connor family and Rosanne had in common with grunge music, or alternative music. When they came onto the scene, they didn't represent this well-refined family who had it all together, but they and had great jobs and whatever, but they represented the blue-collar family, which was most of the people who were watching the show. Dan, he worked in construction. He worked on cars. His hobbies seemed to be the hobbies of people of the that were of the average American. Rosanne, and they did have the family kind of intact. I mean, there's still some television stuff going on, but they had major problems. The kids did stuff that actually I knew that people did. For example, in one episode, they were told to not go to a concert, and they snuck out, and they might even stole a car and snuck out and then came back and got caught. Boyfriends living, in their house or staying in their house or coming over when they weren't supposed to come over. And it seemed to represent what was actually going on in the homes of most people more than something like Family Ties or the Huxtables. So it resonated more. Now, you did see this in other shows at the time, but I think there was a reason why the Connors were a little special. So I've said this before about Married with Children. I was a huge Married with Children fan at the time. And Married with Children came out on Fox about the same year, ran about the same amount of time. And the reason why it was so popular, it was the anti-Huxtables. Fox came out, they were trying to compete with other, with NBC and ABC and be its own major network. And they wanted to do something different. And they succeeded. However, Married with Children was the caricature of that family. It was the opposite of the Huxtables, but it was a caricature of everything that was opposite of the Huxtables. No one really lived that way. Now, your family may have been more that way than the Huxtables or the Keatons, but it was a caricature. It was excess. It was drawn out, which made it funny and made it that TV relatable on the other end. But the Connor family, Rosanne, that was like a more realistic version of the Bundys. It was a more realistic version of what they were going through. And so I think that connected a tad bit more with people because that's what they were going through, as I've said before. And then you had a slew of shows come out that kind of tried to imitate that, because anytime you have success, you have the imitation of success. In music and in film and in TV, it's just all around the board. When an executive who's trying to make money sees a recipe and that recipe is selling, then you try to duplicate that recipe. It's just what you do. Okay, so let's talk about the decline of this. Now, why did it decline? And it has to do with the same reason why grunge music and alternative rock kind of declined later. And because of, even though you have all this connection, even though you have all this, this is what I'm like, and this is what TV's like, and these two things are more connected than ever, and now there's this explosion. Even that can't last long either. That goes downhill just like the previous one went downhill, but for different reasons. But it's kind of weird because it's this weird balance. This is just me spinning this in my head. And that is the element of the desire of fantasy that we all have. Yes, the Connors are more like my family. Yes, I relate to them. Yes, and because I relate to them and many people relate to them, their show went off, boom, bang. Yes, grunge and alternative rock are more relatable to me. Lyrical content, aesthetic content, absolutely 100%, and bang, it goes off. However, I want to be drawn out of my own life sometimes. I don't want to watch TV and just be reminded of my own life, of my own existence. There's an element of fantasy that I want, and I want it in my entertainment. I don't want my entertainment to always reflect what I'm going through. I want some amount of escapism. And so when you get this disconnect, and it gets popular, and then you get this connect and it gets popular, and people get just as tired of that as they got tired of the previous one. And they realize, hey, I want some of that fantasy back. I want to watch a family that's nothing like what I'm like. I want to watch a family that does have it all together, and so you get this back and forth thing. And so that family dynamic went unpopular as well. It went the way of cancellation as well. And there are other reasons too. I mean, you can only tell the same story so many times. There's only the same amount of tropes you can use. And anyway, you want to see a new dynamic with new tropes and things like that. But they went downhill because of this because it's too much of kind of a good thing, or too much of reality, or too much of a bad thing, or whatever. However you want to put it on, it was too much. It's too much, and eventually you want that fantasy. You want that thing in your mind, that unrealistic escapism that a show like Family Ties has to offer you, which a show like The Connors doesn't. So I think there's a little bit of back and forth there, and I think that's why it went down. So that's the show. That's the connection that I made, and that's what I really wanted to get at. And you let me know. What did you think? Do you think that I'm right about that? Do you think I am right about about the situation, or do you think I'm right about the connection, the disconnection, all of it? Do you think I'm wrong? Was there something I overmissed? What connections did you see between the two? Or what connections did I make that you said you don't see those connections at all? Leave them in the comments section below. And thank you for watching. I'm Ian C. This has been Retro Serial Podcast Edition. If you like what we're doing here, don't forget to subscribe to the channel. Share this on your favorite social media. Hit that bell notification. And I think that's it. Yeah, like, comment, subscribe, share. That'd be great. If you're listening to this on podcast platform, please leave me an honest review. And I don't want you to lie for me. If you think the show's horrible, give it a 1 star. If you think it's great, give it a 5 star. If you think it's somewhat good, give it a 4 star. Write a review. It would mean a lot to me. Thanks as always, and we will talk to you again on another episode of Retro Serial Podcast. Hey, thanks for listening. And just wanted to remind you that if you're listening to us on podcast platform, we do have exclusive video content over on YouTube. I just did a top 5 TV moms and dads of Generation X. So head on over. And if you're already on YouTube and you liked this video, well, you also might like these videos.